The night manager turned her away at 11:20, and he did it without once looking up from the screen. "Nothing available," Lawrence Pike said. "We're full." Esme Hartigan stood at the long marble desk of the Brearley Grand with a small wheeled case at her heel, and rain still bright on the shoulders of her coat, and she watched him not look at her. The lobby behind her was the color of weak tea and old money, gilt going soft at the edges, a chandelier with 3 bulbs out, a carpet worn to its backing along the line where 40 years of guests had walked from the door to the lift. It had been a beautiful hotel once. You could still see the bones of it under the tiredness, the way you can see a face in an old photograph of someone gone gray. "You've 14 rooms dark on the 3rd floor, Esme said. "I can see the board from here." Pike's eyes flicked up then, just for a second, and what was in them wasn't apology. It was the quick, cold calculation of a man deciding how much trouble a person was likely to be. He took her in, the good coat that had seen a few winters, the sensible shoes, the case that was cabin-sized because she traveled light, the absence of a driver or a porter or any of the signals the Brearley was built to read. He filed her where men like Pike filed women like her, which was not worth the bother, and he went back to his screen. "Those rooms are out of service," he said. "Maintenance. I can recommend the Premier Inn by the station, 20-minute walk. You'll want to mind the underpass this time of night." "It's raining." He clicked something. "Will there be anything else?" There was a girl on the desk beside him. Priya, her name badge said, couldn't have been more than 19, knew enough that she still flinched when her manager was rude. And Esme caught the girl's eyes going from Pike to her and back, the small helpless flick of someone who knows a thing is wrong and hasn't yet learned she's allowed to say so. The girl's hand had moved, just slightly, toward the booking screen, a half-reflex, the instinct of someone who'd been trained to help before she'd been trained to obey, and then stopped, and went back to the edge of the desk and gripped it. Esme saw the whole small war of it happen in about a second. She gave the girl a look that said it's all right, not your fault, and the girl looked down at her hands. "No," Esme said, "nothing else." She wheeled her case back out into the rain, and Lawrence Pike forgot her before the revolving door had finished turning, which was the single most expensive thing he would ever do, though it would be 11 days before he understood that, and by then it would be far too late to take it back. Here is what Lawrence Pike thought he knew, standing dry behind his marble desk while he sent a woman out into the wet. That the Brearley Grand was a tired old pile he managed on behalf of an ownership too distant and too disorganized to ask hard questions. That a guest with a cabin case and no driver was a guest who could be turned away without consequence, and that he, Pike, had the run of the place. All 3 of those things were wrong, and the woman now standing under the dripping portico looking up at the dark 3rd-floor windows was the reason. Esme Hartigan owned the Brearley Grand. Not on paper that anyone at the front desk could see. The hotel was held through a family trust, 3 generations deep, behind a wall of holding companies that existed precisely so that the name Hartigan never appeared on a letterhead. Her grandmother had built it. Her father had loved it and run it well and then got sick and run it badly, and then died, and the trust had passed to a board of trustees and a managing director, and Esme, who had spent her 20s and 30s a long way away, building hotels for other people under her married name, learning the trade from the inside of a dozen great houses across 3 countries, had stayed away, because coming home had felt, for a long time, like more grief than she could carry. She'd had her reasons for going, too, beyond the grief. She'd married a man who traveled and built her career in his slipstream and then well past it, and the marriage had ended the quiet way good marriages sometimes end, without anyone to blame, and she'd kept the name because by then the name was hers. It was over 100 reception desks she'd designed, in the minds of people who hired her, the thing she'd made herself into when she didn't want to be a Hartigan, didn't want to be the girl whose family owned the jewel of a seaside town. She'd spent a long time being anyone but that girl. It had taken the slow strangling of her father's hotel to teach her she'd never stopped being her. Not really. You can put a name down. You can't put down the thing your father taught you with his hands. What he taught her mostly was how to walk a hotel. He used to take her round the Brearley before opening when she was small, the two of them in the empty dawn corridors, and he'd stop and sniff and say flowers are tired, tell Pelhams, or run a thumb along a skirting board and frown, or stand in the silent dining room and just listen to it. And she hadn't understood then that he was reading the building, taking its pulse, the way she'd later read 100 buildings for other people. She understood it now. She'd come back to take the Brearley's pulse and found it faint. Then the numbers had started to bother her. She read them every quarter because the trust sent them and because she was her father's daughter and couldn't help it. And for 3 years the numbers had told a story that didn't hang together. Occupancy down, which the market explained. Revenue down further than occupancy, which it didn't. Costs up, refurbishment, maintenance, consultancy. A fog of line items that grew thicker every quarter, and a hotel that, when she looked at the photographs the trust circulated, somehow never seemed to actually get refurbished. Money was going in. Nothing was coming out the other side but a building going quietly to seed and a managing director, a smooth man named Roland Crail, who explained every shortfall with the patient regret of a doctor delivering a poor prognosis on a patient nobody could blame him for. She could have sent accountants. That was the obvious thing, and the trustees would have backed her, and Roland Crail would have produced a fog of paper thick enough to keep a forensic team busy for 2 years, while the money kept walking out the back door. Esme had spent 20 years in hotels. She knew that the truth of a hotel is never in the paper. It's in the building, in the linen cupboards and the kitchen pass, and the night audit and the faces of the staff, in the 1,000 small physical tells that a place gives off when it's being run honestly, and the different 1,000 it gives off when it's being bled. You couldn't read those from a boardroom. You could only read them from the inside, on the floor, as a nobody. So she'd come to the Brearley as a nobody. No name, no warning, a cabin case and a good coat gone soft with age. She'd meant to check in quietly, take a room for a fortnight, watch, listen, learn exactly how her family's hotel was being hollowed out and by whom, and then decide what to do with what she found. Lawrence Pike had just turned the owner away from her own front desk because she didn't look worth the bother. Esme stood under the portico and laughed once, quietly, into the rain. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has just been handed the exact measure of how bad things have got, because a hotel where the night manager turns away paying guests to keep 14 clean rooms dark is not a hotel that's merely badly run. It's a hotel where the dark rooms are worth more to someone than the guests are. And that was a much more interesting problem than the one she'd come to solve. She did not go to the Premier Inn. She walked 20 minutes in the wet, all right, but not to the station. She walked to a small terraced guest house 3 streets back from the seafront, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a landlady who did a proper breakfast. And she'd booked it a week ago under the name on the card she was traveling with, Esme Marsh, her married name, the name she'd built her whole career under, the name that connected to nothing anyone at the Brearley would ever think to check. The landlady, a brisk woman called Dot, took one look at her dripping in the hall and put the kettle on without being asked. "Bad night to be out," Dot said. "You here for work or for the sea?" "Work," Esme said. "Boring sort. I look at hotels." "Inspector?" Dot's eyes lit up. Everyone loved an inspector. "Ooh, you want to do the Brearley, state of it now. Used to be the jewel of this town, that place. My mum did her wedding there. Now," she made a face, "my nephew worked there 6 months and left, said it broke his heart, said they've let it rot on purpose and he couldn't work out why." She set down the tea. "You won't print that, will you? He'd not want trouble." Esme wrapped both hands round the mug. "No," she said, "I won't print anything." She blew on the tea. "Tell me about your nephew, though. What did he mean, on purpose?" And Dot, who had no idea she was talking to the woman who owned the building her nephew's heart had broken in, pulled out a chair and sat down and started to talk, and Esme Hartigan listened the way she'd learned to listen in 20 years of great houses, not for the headline, but for the thread you could pull. There was always a thread. Dot's nephew had found one without knowing what it was. By the time the tea was cold, Esme had the first inch of it in her hand. She'd start tomorrow, not as the owner, as a temp. Because the other thing 20 years in hotels had taught her was that nobody on earth is more invisible or better placed to watch everything than the woman they've just hired to fold the towels. The Brearley was so short-staffed that nobody questioned a quiet, competent woman who turned up through an agency and asked for nothing. That was the first thing the hotel told Esme before she'd folded a single towel. A place hemorrhaging staff is a place where something is wrong that the staff can feel and can't fix, so they leave, and the ones who stay are either trapped or in on it. She watched to learn which were which. The housekeeper who trained her was called Bridget, 50-odd, hands like a docker's, 22 years at the Brearley, and the kind of loyal that curdles slowly into grief when it watches a thing it loves go bad. Bridget showed her the linen cupboards, half empty, the good Egyptian cotton her father had bought replaced with a thin gray poly blend that pilled after 3 washes, and the way she touched the old stuff that was left, folding it with a tenderness that had nothing to do with the job, told Esme more than a year of accounts. Used to change the flowers daily, Bridget said, not to Esme exactly, to the cupboard. Fresh from Pelham's on the corner, Mr. Hartigan insisted. You'd come in of a morning and the whole landing smelled of stocks and lily. She shut the cupboard. Silk now, dusty silk. Nobody's told Pelham's why the order stopped. I see the daughter in there sometimes. The florist's girl looks at me like we owe her money. A pause. We probably do. Esme filed it. Pelham's unpaid. Another inch of thread. There was a thing Bridget did that Esme couldn't stop watching. At the end of a shift, when she thought no one was looking, the housekeeper would walk the second-floor landing, not the third, the dark one, the second, where guests still went, and she'd straighten the pictures. They didn't need straightening. Esme checked the third day after Bridget had gone home. The frames were dead level, every one. Bridget straightened pictures that were already straight, every night. A small private ritual of a woman holding a line against a tide, doing the one thing she still could in a place where everything else had been taken out of her hands. Esme had seen grief do a lot of things to a lot of people. She'd never seen it look quite like a woman leveling a level picture in an empty corridor, and it told her, more than any docket, that the Brearley still had a heart somewhere in it, and that the heart was on the staff floor, not the management one. You've been here a long time, Esme said to her once, careful, attempt making talk. Why stay, if it's as bad as all that? Bridget folded a sheet, corner to corner, sharp. Where would I go, she said, which wasn't an answer, and then, after a while, which was, somebody's got to remember what it was, else when it's gone, it's like it was never anything, like my whole life was spent on a thing that didn't matter. She set the sheet on the pile. I'm not staying for them. I'm staying so there's a witness. So when somebody finally asks, and I always thought somebody might, one day, there'd be one person left who could say, no, it wasn't always like this, it was beautiful, and they killed it on purpose. She looked at Esme, and for a second there was something sharp and searching in it. You ask a lot of questions for an agency girl. Bad habit, Esme said. I'll fold. Bridget watched her fold one, then another, the proper way, fast and square, the way you only learn from years of it and never from an agency. Bridget said, and didn't push it, but Esme felt herself half seen and filed that too, that the people the hotel had hurt were sharper than the people it paid, because pain pays attention. She worked 4 days before she let herself go near the thing she'd actually come for, because rushing was how you got found out, and getting found out meant Crail would have 2 years' warning to bury everything. She folded towels. She stripped beds. She learned the rhythm of the place, who came and went, which suppliers' vans pulled up to the kitchen door and which didn't, and she watched the dark rooms. 14 rooms on the 3rd floor, out of service for maintenance, and in 4 days not one maintenance man went up there. Esme checked. She found reasons to be on the third floor landing with her trolley at odd hours, and the corridor of dark rooms stayed dark and silent and locked, except that twice she saw Lawrence Pike come up in the service lift, alone, late, with a hold all, and let himself into one of them and come down 40 minutes later without it. Whatever the dark rooms were for, they weren't empty, and they weren't being fixed. The kitchen gave her the next piece. She'd swapped a shift to help in the back. They were that short, and she stood at the pass watching deliveries come in against the dockets, and the dockets were a small masterpiece. The Brearley was being invoiced for food at the volume of a hotel running at full occupancy, premium suppliers, top prices. What actually came through the door was half that cheaper, and the chef, a tired man called Marcus who'd stopped caring in a way that was its own kind of caring, signed for the full amount anyway, every time without looking, because the one time he'd queried it Crail's office had queried his employment. "You learn not to count," Marcus told her when she asked, careful like a temp making conversation. "Counting's above my pay grade now, apparently." He scraped a pan. "Used to run this kitchen like a Michelin man. Now I sign for ghosts and cook for nobody, and I'll tell you what, love, the day I find another job I'm gone, and I hope the whole place falls in the sea." He caught himself. "Don't repeat that." "Repeat what?" Esme said, and Marcus almost smiled, the first almost smile she'd seen on him. The shape of it was coming clear, and it was uglier and more ordinary than she'd hoped. Roland Crail was running the oldest hotel scam there is, scaled up and dressed in corporate clothes. Inflated supplier invoices through companies he controlled, the difference skimmed. A refurbishment budget that vanished into consultancy, his own consultancy, almost certainly, billing the trust for work that never touched the building. Staff costs claimed for positions that didn't exist. And the hotel deliberately, methodically run down, because a failing hotel is a hotel you can eventually persuade trustees to sell cheap, to a buyer who turns out, when you follow the holding companies far enough, to be the man who ran it into the ground. Crail wasn't bleeding the Brearley by accident. He was bleeding it toward a sale, and he was the buyer, and the dark rooms and the dusty silk and the unpaid florist were all just the slow strangling of a thing he meant to pick up cheap off its own corpse. She needed to follow the holding companies. That was the proof, not the dusty linen, which was heartbreak but not evidence, but the paper trail that led from the inflated invoices through the shells to Crail's own pocket and to the buyer waiting in the wings. And that paper wasn't in the linen cupboard. It was in Crail's office, and in the trust's records, and in the registry filings of a dozen companies. And Esme, who had a married name that connected to nothing and a forensic patience she'd inherited from her father along with the hotel, began, in the evenings at Dots, to pull it apart. She wasn't a detective. She kept reminding herself of that. She was an hotelier. But an hotelier who has built properties for 20 years knows exactly how the money is supposed to flow through a building, which means she knows, better than any outside accountant, exactly where it's flowing wrong. She could read these accounts the way her father had read a dining room. She could see the lie because she knew so precisely what the truth was meant to look like. It was the girl from the front desk who nearly got her caught. Priya, 19, knew the one who'd flinched the first night came up to her on the 5th day in the staff corridor by the time clock and said, in a rush like she'd been working up to it, "You were here. The first night. You came in the rain and Mr. Pike sent you away." Her hands were knotted in front of her. I felt awful. We had rooms. I knew we had rooms, and I didn't say anything, and I keep thinking about it." She swallowed. "Why'd you come back? As a temp, that's mad. After how he treated you." And there it was, the moment the careful thing could come apart, because a sharp, frightened 19-year-old had noticed the one detail that didn't fit. The woman turned away in the rain doesn't come back the next week to fold towels for minimum wage. Esme had a half-second to decide, and she made the decision she'd keep making through the whole business, which was to trust the people the hotel was hurting, and not the people it was paying. "Can you keep something to yourself?" Esme said. "Properly, not even your mum." Priya's eyes went wide. She nodded. "I came back," Esme said, Because I'm trying to find out why a hotel with 14 empty clean rooms turns paying guests away in the rain. And I think you've been wanting to ask someone that question for a while. She watched the girl's face. Have you? Priya let out a breath like she'd been holding it for a month. The rooms, she whispered. The third floor. Pike does the bookings for them off system. Cash. People come and go and there's no record, and he told me if I ever touched those room numbers I'd be out the same day. Her chin trembled. I thought it was, I didn't want to think what it was. I need this job, my family. She stopped. I should have said something the first night. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. You're saying it now, Esme said. That's the part that counts. Hardly anyone ever gets to the saying it. She put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Brief. Don't change anything. Don't be braver than usual. Don't be quieter than usual. Just be exactly as you were yesterday and keep your eyes open. And when I ask you a thing, tell me the truth. Can you do that? Priya nodded. Steadier now. The way people steady when someone finally treats their fear as information instead of weakness. That was Esme's first real ally inside the walls. She'd have 3 more before the end. Bridget, who'd loved the place too long to watch it die quiet. Marcus, who wanted the satisfaction more than the safety. And in the end, the one she'd least expected. The one she least expected found her, not the other way round. And he found her 2 days later in the staff car park in the dark, and her heart nearly stopped when the shape detached itself from the wall. It was Lawrence Pike's deputy, a man called Gordon Sleet, mid-40s, gray, the kind of middle manager who'd kept his head down through 3 years of rot, and whom Esme had written off as Crails because he signed what he was told and said nothing. She'd been wrong about him, the way she'd nearly been wrong about Priya, and the lesson was the same. You can't always read who's trapped and who's complicit from the outside, because trapped and complicit look identical right up until the moment a person gets a chance to choose. You're not agency, Sleet said, no preamble. His hands were jammed in his coat pockets and he wouldn't look straight at her. Agency don't ask Marcus about Calder Reach. I do the kitchen invoices. I know who asks about Calder Reach. A long breath fogging in the cold. I've been signing things for 3 years I shouldn't have signed. Pike's bookings, Crail's numbers. I told myself it wasn't my business. I've got a mortgage. I've got a lad at university. He scuffed the tarmac. My wife asked me last month why I don't sleep. I couldn't tell her because the answer's that I help a man rob a hotel 40 hours a week and smile at him doing it. He finally looked up. Whoever you are. Whatever you're doing, I want in. Not for I don't want anything out of it. I just want to be able to tell my wife what I do for a living without the lights off. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her inside the Brearley's walls, and it came from the man she'd trusted least. And Esme stood in the dark car park and recalibrated everything, because Gordon Sleet signed the invoices, which meant Gordon Sleet could prove from the inside the link between the fake companies and the man who controlled them. The one thing she still lacked in a form a trustee couldn't wave away. You can write down what you signed, she said, and who told you to, dated in your own hand. Yeah, he nodded fast, like a man stepping off a high thing before he can think better of it. Yeah, God. Yeah, and then quieter, will I lose the house? I don't know, Esme said, because she wouldn't lie to him, not about that. I can't promise you won't pay something for 3 years of signing, but I can promise you the people who pay most are going to be the ones at the top, not the one who walked into a car park in the dark and chose to stop. That's worth something to a court. It's worth more than something to me. She held his eye. Go home, sleep if you can, write it tomorrow when your hands are steady. Gordon Sleet went home. Esme heard later that he slept that night for the first time in months, and that his wife noticed. And that he still didn't tell her why, not yet, but that he'd stopped lying with his body even before he stopped lying with his words, and that was where it started. Then, on the 6th day, Roland Crail came to the hotel, and Esme, mop in hand on the mezzanine, got her first look at the man who'd spent 3 years strangling her father's hotel, and understood within a minute that he was cleverer than Pike, cleverer than the scheme needed him to be. And that the moment he had any reason to look twice at the quiet temp on the stairs, The whole thing was over. He looked twice at her on his way to the lift. He didn't stop. But his eyes came back to her a second time, the way a man's eyes come back to a face that's filed somewhere he can't place, and Esme felt the cold drop of it in her stomach, because Roland Crail had been at her father's funeral. He'd shaken her hand at the graveside years ago, when she was just the grieving daughter from abroad, and he was the smooth new managing director promising to look after everything. There was a worse layer under it, and she made herself look at it that night at Dot's. If Crail half remembered her face, the danger wasn't only that he'd expose her and end the operation. It was that a man running a scheme the size of the one she'd uncovered, with a second hidden business in the dark rooms, was a man with a great deal to lose and people on a cash payroll who came and went without records. She'd been thinking of the risk as discovery. Sitting in Dot's small bright room with the registry filings open on the bedspread, she let herself think of it as something colder. The dark rooms weren't a metaphor. Whoever used them for things that left no paper, and a woman who'd photographed the wrong landing at the wrong hour was exactly the sort of loose thread such people knew how to deal with quietly. She wasn't only racing Crail's memory. She was racing it while standing closer to something dangerous than she'd let herself admit. She rang the trust's solicitor that night, not to act yet, just to lodge a single fact, that Esme Hartigan was conducting a private review at the Brearley in person, and that if she went quiet for more than 48 hours, he was to open the sealed file and go to the police. It wasn't drama. It was a handrail. She'd built enough hotels on dangerous deadlines to know you put the handrail in before you need it, not after. He didn't stop that first look in the lobby, but his eyes had come back to her, and Esme stood with her mop and her heart going hard in roughly 4 days, she guessed, before he placed her, and a scheme that needed weeks left to prove. The clock had just started, and she hadn't been the one to start it. She had 4 days, maybe fewer, and the proof still scattered across a registry and a locked office. So Esme did what she'd learned to do when a build went wrong on a deadline. She stopped trying to do everything and worked out the one thing that, if she had it, made all the rest unnecessary. The one thing was the link. She had the symptoms, the dark rooms, the inflated dockets, the dusty silk, Priya's cash bookings, Bridget's grief, Marcus's ghosts. What she didn't have, in a form a trustee couldn't wave away, was the line that ran from a fake invoice into Roland Crail's own hand. Everything else was a hotel being run badly, and Crail could explain a badly run hotel from now until the sea came in. The line was what hanged him, and the line lived in the registry filings of the shell companies, public. If you knew which companies to look for, and she didn't, not yet, because the shells were named like furniture, anonymous, and there were dozens. It was Marcus who handed it to her, without quite meaning to. She'd asked him careful which supplier the inflated meat invoices came through, just a temp curious about the kitchen, the way temps are, and Marcus, scraping his eternal pan, said the name of the company, and then said the thing that cracked it open. Funny name for a meat firm. Calder Reach Provisioning. Sounds like a holiday cottage, he snorted. There's a whole family of them and all. Calder Reach this, Calder Reach that. The laundry's one, the maintenance lot are one. All the same daft name. He didn't know what he'd said. Esme thanked him and went and stood in the walk-in fridge for a minute on her own in the cold, because Calder Reach was the thread, the family name on the shells, the word you could type into the registry and pull the whole net up by. That night at Dot's she typed it in, and the net came up. Calder Reach Provisioning, Calder Reach Linen Services, Calder Reach Maintenance and Consultancy. 6 of them, all incorporated within the same 8-week window 3 years ago, which was to say, within 8 weeks of Roland Crail taking full operational control of the trust's hotel, and all 6 listing as a director or person of significant control behind a thin curtain of nominees, the same accountant. Not Crail himself. Crail was far too careful for that. A man called Desmond Frift, Crail's accountant, the nominee, the firewall. But a firewall is only as good as the gap behind it, and Esme had spent 20 years watching how money actually moves through a hotel, and she could see, in the dates and the sums and the matching of invoice to filing, the shape of the whole machine. The Brearley overpaying 6 fake companies, the 6 companies feeding Frift feeding Crail, and the drained husk of the hotel sliding every quarter closer to the cheap sale that Crail, through a 7th company she now went looking for and found, had positioned himself to make. She had it, or she had enough of it to be dangerous, which in a forensic sense is not the same as enough to be safe. And she was out of days, because the next morning Lawrence Pike was waiting by the time clock with a look on his face she'd seen on men about to enjoy themselves. "Mr. Crail wants the agency temp's paperwork," he said. "All of it says there's a discrepancy." His eyes went over her slow, and there was the cold calculation again, and under it now something that might have been the beginning of recognition catching up to him too. "Funny, he asked about you specially. The quiet one on housekeeping. Wanted to know where the agency found you." He smiled. "Where did they find you, love?" "Lancashire," Esme said, which was true and gave him nothing, and she went up to strip beds with her heart going hard and the understanding cold and clear in her chest that she had until the end of the day, no more. She didn't run. Running meant leaving the inside before she'd secured the one thing she still lacked, which was Priya's off-system booking ledger, the cash record of the dark rooms, the only piece that turned the scheme from financial fraud into something the police would move on fast, because the dark rooms, she was now nearly certain, weren't just held empty to drag occupancy down. Pike's late hold all, the cash, the people who came and went with no record, that was a second business running inside the first, and Esme didn't yet know its exact shape but knew its smell, and knew that it was the kind of thing that, once named to the right authority, ended a man like Crail not in a civil suit in 5 years but in a cell in 5 weeks. She found Priya in the linen room at noon and told her the truth, all of it fast, because there was no longer time for anything but truth. That she wasn't a temp, that she owned the hotel, that Crail was stealing it, that she needed the off-system ledger and she needed it in the next 2 hours, and that if Priya got it for her the girl would never have to be frightened of Lawrence Pike again as long as she lived. Priya stared at her. 19 years old, family who needed the wage, a manager who'd promised her the sack if she touched those room numbers, and a woman in a housekeeping tabard telling her she was the owner and asking her to risk the one job standing between her family and trouble. It was an enormous thing to ask, and Esme watched her ask it land, and watched the girl's fear and her decency go to war across her face, and didn't rush her, because some choices a person has to make all the way themselves or they don't hold. "If you're lying to me," Priya said very quietly, "I lose everything." "I know. And if you're not, then you're the person who helped take it back, and I don't forget that, ever." Esme held her eyes. "I can't promise you it's safe. I can only promise you it's true, and that I'll be standing in front of you when it breaks, not behind you." Priya was quiet for a long moment. Then she wiped her hands on her skirt the way her grandmother probably did and said, "The ledger's a blue book. He keeps it in the back of the key safe behind the desk. I know the code." She was already moving. "Pike goes on his break at 12:30. Give me 10 minutes." The blue book was the thing that did it. Esme photographed every page in the staff toilets with the door locked and her hands not quite steady, and she sent the lot, the registry filings, the docket photographs, the Calder Reach net, the blue book, to 3 places before she let herself breathe. To the solicitor who acted for the trust and answered to her and not to Crail. To a contact at the firm of forensic accountants the trustees could appoint over Crail's head, and in a sealed account with instructions to herself. Only then did she walk out of the Brearley staff door for the last time as a nobody, past Lawrence Pike returning from his break, who looked at her going and frowned, half placing her, 12 hours too late. Now she could stop being invisible. Now being seen was the whole point. She convened the trustees. That took 2 days and a great deal of her father's old authority channeled through a married name she now set down for good, picking up the one she'd been born to. The trustees, 3 of them, decent and distant and ashamed, once they saw what they'd let happen under their noses, agreed to the thing Esme proposed, which was not a quiet dismissal and not a slow lawsuit, but something her father would have understood in his bones. That it should happen at the hotel in the open, in front of the people Crail had lied to. Because Roland Crail had, with exquisite timing, scheduled a thing of his own for that Friday, a reception. A vision evening for the Brearleys' future, the local press, the trustees he thought he controlled, a scattering of the town's great and good, and though only Esme and the trustees knew it, the prospective buyer of the rundown hotel brought along discreetly to be reassured. Crail meant to stand in his dying hotel and sell its corpse to a room. Esme let the evening go ahead exactly as Crail had planned it, because he'd built her the perfect stage, and it would have been a waste not to use it. She walked in at 8, through the revolving door she'd been turned out of 11 days before, in a coat that was no longer soft with age, and the staff who'd known her as the quiet temp on housekeeping turned to look, and Lawrence Pike, working the door of the function room, saw her and went the color of the lobby carpet. "You can't," he started. "I own this hotel, Mr. Pike," Esme said pleasantly, not stopping. "I rather think I can." What happened in the function room over the next half hour was not the clean public confession the moment seemed to promise, because Roland Crail was clever and proud and did not break. He denied. He smiled his patient doctor's smile and called it a misunderstanding, a disgruntled temp, a fantasy, and for a few minutes, because he was good, because the room wanted to believe the smooth man over the strange story, it nearly held. The trustees looked uncertain. The press looked at their shoes. Crail spread his hands and spoke of his years of devoted service. So Esme didn't argue with him. She'd learned that from 20 years of difficult rooms. You don't beat a confident liar by being louder. You make the room read the evidence themselves. She had the forensic accountant there, and the solicitor, and on the screen Crail had set up for his own vision presentation she put the Calder Reach net, the 6 companies and their dates and Desmond Frith's name behind the curtain, and beside it the inflated dockets with Marcus's forced signature, and beside that the blue book, the cash ledger of the dark rooms, and she let the room do the arithmetic. She named the buyer in the room out loud, and watched the trustees' faces change as they understood that the discreet guest Crail had introduced as an investor was the man positioned to buy the Brearley cheap off the wreck Crail had made of it. And then Bridget stepped forward, 22 years of loyalty gone to grief, and said simply, to the trustees she'd known for decades, "It's true. All of it, we've watched them do it. We just didn't know what we were allowed to say. And Marcus said, 'I signed for ghosts, I'll sign a statement now.' And Priya, white and shaking and 19, said, 'I have the room codes and the dates.' And the one that turned the trustees' faces gray, because he was management, because he was supposed to be Crail's, Gordon Sleet stood up at the back with a folded statement in his own hand and said, not loudly, 'I signed the Calder Reach invoices. He told me to. I wrote down every time. It's all here,' and held the paper up like a man holding up the thing that had been keeping him awake for 3 years. The room turned, the way a room turns when the people who actually run a place all stand up at once and tell the same truth. Crail stopped smiling somewhere in there. Not in surrender, men like him don't surrender in a room, they regroup, but the smile stopped reaching, and that was as much as the evening was ever going to get from him, and it was enough, because the evidence didn't need his face to confirm it. The reversal took its full course over the months that followed, the way real ones do. The forensic accountants, given the thread Esme had handed them, pulled the whole net up and traced the Calder Reach money home. The off-system ledger brought in the police, and the darkroom business, which turned out to be exactly the kind of thing Esme had smelled and won't be dwelt on here, except to say it ended careers and not just contracts, brought them in fast. Desmond Frith, the firewall, did what firewalls do when the heat comes for them alone, and gave up Crail to save himself. Crail fought it to the last, because pride was the engine of him and pride doesn't break. He was still issuing statements about vindication when the charges were laid. The cheap sale never happened. The buyer melted back into the holding companies he'd come from. Lawrence Pike, who turned the owner out into the rain, was gone within the week. Not with drama, just a locker cleared and a final pay packet, and the particular small ruin of a man who finds out that the one person he treated as beneath his notice was the one person who could end him. He'd built his whole petty kingdom on reading who was worth the bother, and he'd misread the only face that mattered, and there's no insurance against that. Esme didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The arithmetic did it for her. Gordon Sleet did pay something, as she'd warned him he might. A caution, a long conversation with the forensic team, a year of looking over his shoulder waiting for worse that never came, because the court could see the difference between the man who built the machine and the man who'd walked into a car park in the dark to help take it apart. He kept the house. He kept his lad at university. And the day it was finally, formally over, he came and found Esme and said, "I told my wife, all of it." Took me an hour. His eyes were wet and he was furious about it. She said she'd known for 2 years something was wrong and she'd been waiting for me to be the man who fixed it instead of the man who slept badly. He laughed, a wrecked sort of laugh. 20 years married. She knew before I did. Esme kept him on in the end in a job where the only thing he ever had to sign was the truth, and he was good at it, the way people are good at a thing once it stops costing them their sleep. She kept the hotel. Of course she kept it. She took the name Hartigan back over the door, and she did the thing Crail had spent 3 years pretending to do and never done. She actually refurbished it. Slowly. Honestly. The good Egyptian cotton back in the cupboards and fresh flowers from Pelham's on every landing. The bill to Pelham's paid in full with 3 years' interest, and an apology Esme delivered in person to a florist's daughter who'd thought the hotel owed her money and hadn't known the hotel agreed. Bridget became head housekeeper and cried when she was told and pretended she hadn't. Marcus got his kitchen back and his Michelin habits with it, and stopped hoping the place fell in the sea. And Priya, 19-year-old Priya, who'd risked everything on the word of a stranger in a tabard. Esme moved off the front desk and into the office, into training, because a girl who'll do the frightening right thing when it costs her is worth more to a hotel than any number of men who'll do the smooth wrong one when it pays. On a clear evening months on, with the chandelier mended and all its bulbs lit for the first time in years, Esme stood in the lobby where she'd been turned away and watched the place breathe. Dot from the guest house had come for the reopening. Esme had insisted, and stood beside her with a glass of something, having forgiven Esme the deception inside about 4 seconds of being told it, because Dot was that sort. "My mum did her wedding here," Dot said, looking up at the light. "I told you that, first night in my hall, dripping." She shook her head. "I was telling the woman who owned it. You let me rattle on about your own hotel." "You told me the truth about it," Esme said. "Your nephew was right. They did let it rot on purpose. I just needed someone who loved it to say so out loud before I was sure." She touched her glass to Dot's. "He didn't break his heart for nothing, your nephew. Tell him that. Tell him it's mended." Dot's eyes went bright. "What made you do it the hard way?" she asked. "You could have sent the lawyers. Why come yourself, fold the towels, get turned out in the rain?" Esme thought about her father, who'd known every member of staff by name and every landing by its smell, who taught her that a hotel is not a building or a balance sheet, but a few hundred people deciding every day whether to care, and how easy it is to make them stop, and how nearly impossible to make them start again. "Because you can't read a hotel from a boardroom," she said, "and you can't fix what you won't stand inside." Crail ran this place for 3 years from an office and a spreadsheet, and never once knew the linen had changed or the flowers had stopped, because he didn't care to be where the truth was. She watched a porter, a new one, a kind-faced lad, help an elderly guest with her cases, unprompted, the way the Brearley used to. "They turned me away because I didn't look worth the bother." That's the whole sickness of a place like this. When it goes wrong, it stops being able to see anyone who can't do something for it. The cure's the same as the cause, just backwards. You start seeing people again, starting with the ones in the rain. She smiled and lifted her glass to the mended light. My dad knew that. I'd just forgotten I did too. The door turned, and a guest came in out of the dark with rain on her shoulders and a cabin case at her heel, and the new lad on the desk looked up at once and smiled and said, "Good evening, terrible night. Let's get you warm," and reached for a key. And Esme Hartigan watched her hotel welcome a stranger in from the wet and knew she was home. Behind the desk where the blue book used to live in the back of the key safe, there was nothing now but keys. She'd checked. It was the first thing she'd done the morning she took the place back, and the last thing she thought about, most nights, before the lights went down on a lobby that was lit, at last, all the way to its mended chandelier.